Side actuating locking mechanisms. Man, do I love these things. I've raved and raved about how much I love side actuating locking mechanisms for a very long time. I just figured I'd make a dedicated video talking about the reasons I like them so much. Hello everybody, Mannix here. Feel free to subscribe, hit that little bell notification if you do not want to miss weekly knife and gun videos. Side actuating locking mechanisms are mechanisms that actuate on the side of the handle, or sides in the cases of all of these knives. The only exception I can think of for a side actuating mechanism that is not ambidextrous would be button locks, where they have a button on one of the sides of the handles. But regardless, these are all what we now call shaft locks, with some exceptions on the table right here. But originally they were known as the Benchmade AXIS locks. When Benchmade patented the mechanism, they basically just looked a lot like these that you're seeing right here. These three essentially are Benchmade AXIS locks, although these three are not Benchmade knives. These are Ozark trail knives, Walmart cheap POSs that actually are very, very functional. But over the years, clones of the AXIS lock started to come out. We had the Spyderco cage ball bearing lock, which functions completely different from the AXIS lock from Benchmade, although externally it operates just about the same. Same thing with these Cold Steel Ultra locks right here. These are going back a long ways, 15 years ago or so, filming this early mid 2024. Again, internal mechanics are slightly different from the Benchmade AXIS lock, but outwardly they basically function the same. So what makes side actuating locking mechanisms, or shaft locks, so great? The first reason, strength. They're very, very, very strong locking mechanisms. If you're not familiar, essentially it's just a tempered pillar. You can see moving right there when I open and close the blade. That is the locking mechanism itself, the shaft lock. Again, this kind of operates pretty much exactly the same as a Benchmade AXIS lock does. There's two springs that are constantly pulling back. You just see them clinging onto the cylinders right there. Those things are constantly pulling the lock bar forward. They're constantly wanting to go back up this way. So when you clear the space and the blade is timed up with the stop pin and the tang is exposed to that pillar, the pillar is pulled forward or pushed forward. So now when it's in the open and locked position, positive force that's making a cut, putting any force on the cutting edge, that is stopped by the stop pin you can see on the left, which prevents the blade from over traveling. And then the negative force, that is force that would go on the spine when you would otherwise be attempting to close the knife, that is stopped by the pillar that rests on the top of the tang of the blade. That's essentially how a shaft lock works. Very, very simple. What makes them so great, other than their strength, easily stronger than liner locks. I would argue stronger than lockbacks. But on top of that, it's all about speed. They're also very, very, very fast. This knife I'm holding does not have any ball bearings. It's just washers. Very fast, no wrist movement needed. Let's check out this 4-inch blade on this monster right here, the Cold Steel Recon 1 old model. Washers, no ball bearings, no wrist movement needed. Flicks out every single time. Here's a cage ball bearing lock, works a little bit differently on the Spyderco Mannix XL. No ball bearings, very fast, no wrist movement needed. And then the fun factor is there. These knives are very, very fun, which is kind of more subjective, but you can flick them open and closed all day long without touching the blade if you wished. They're known for being very, very fun fidget factor locking mechanism. So we got speed, we got strength, we got fidget factor, and they're ambidextrous. Liner locks are not ambidextrous. Liner locks are fast, like these locking mechanisms are, but they're not as strong, and they're usually only righty friendly. Lefties can still use liner locks, but they're slightly more awkward to use than if you were a righty, because liner locks are lopsided. These are not. These are 100% symmetrical, ambidextrous. I have flicked this knife open and closed probably thousands and thousands and thousands of times. It's just so fun, it's so fast, and they're really, really strong. Benchmade years ago made a video showing the AXIS lock on one of their folders withstanding over 600 pounds of pressure. Eventually it broke when it reached almost 700, but 600 pounds of pressure. That's strong. They're very, 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 very strong locking mechanisms. When we get into shock absorption, that's kind of another story, but when we're just talking sheer strength, these are very, very strong. They're going to be very good for tactical use in emergency situations. And again, we have that speed because of their sheer design. We have that versatility. You can either open the blade by pushing the blade open like you would with whatever opening mechanism it has, whether you're flicking it open or whether you're opening it conventionally, or you can ditch the blade altogether and just use the locking mechanism itself, relieve the pressure on it to deploy the blade. And then you can do the exact same thing for closing it. Don't have to touch the blade at all, except for that last moment right there. Try again. There we go, better. They're affordable too. I used to think they were very expensive, but these 4 right here are all around the $5 range from Ozark Trail. This one has kind of a proprietary linear design, but it works exactly the same as the other shaft locks. Very simple, very quick, very strong. Works every time. Good, strong, solid lockup. I don't detect any blade play. This knife's value is about $5. Same with this guy. This was like 4 when it came out. This guy was exactly 5. So is this one. We got our Ultra locks from Cold Steel from back in the day. We have the cage ball bearing locks from Spyderco. What makes this different from a typical shaft lock is that rather than having 2 separate springs pushing the pillar forward, instead we have a single spring pushing it forward, which is attached to a separate piece right in there. And there's a metal ball bearing within the cage, so to speak, cage ball bearing lock, the polymer cage that houses the bearing. The bearing pinches itself between the bottom of the tang of the blade as well as the lock backspacer up here. So also very, very strong. I would actually argue this is probably stronger than a typical shaft lock. I've never seen any tests or anything, but I think the cage ball bearing lock is probably even better. But that's just from my assumption. More or less, it's about the same strength as a typical shaft lock. But again, outwardly, the way it functions, pretty much exactly the same as a shaft lock, not much different at all. So if you're used to shaft locks, you'll get used to cage ball bearing locks from Spyderco in no time. I love side actuating locking mechanisms of all kinds. They're all very strong, fast, simple, affordable, and of course they got that fun little fidget factor as a bonus. But even if that weren't the case, they're still great locking mechanisms. The only disadvantage I can possibly think of with the side actuating mechanisms, maybe the issue of too many parts syndrome, as I like to call it. For example, going back to this guy, we have 2 separate springs clinged onto the pillar. The pillar's one piece, but we have 2, not 1, but 2 springs pushing it back forward. If something went wrong with one of those springs, I believe Benchmade called theirs the Omega springs, you're shit out of luck, my friend. But with any of these knives, I've never seen any of those issues happen, and these 2 Cold Steels are probably almost 15 years old each, somewhere around there, and they still function just fine. So, who knows? Maybe if you did some really heavy shock absorption tests on these guys, maybe you'd have problems with the springs, but personally, I just haven't seen it. Again, they withstand a lot of weight. They can probably all hold hundreds and hundreds of pounds. I'm glad we're finally seeing clones of these shaft locks flooding the market now. I mean, Gonzo's been doing it for a long time. Sanrenmu did it back before it was cool. Enlin. But now we're finally seeing some more name brand American-based companies like Kershaw, CRKT, the Crossbar Lock, one of them calls it, the Duralock, another calls it. Everybody's coming out with their own versions of these shaft locks, or once were just the Benchmade AXIS locks. So glad we're finally seeing more of them. What do you think of the side actuating locking mechanisms? Do you have any favorites? Are there any advantages and or disadvantages I missed in this video? Is there anything you could possibly think that you don't like about these locking mechanisms? What are your experiences? What are your thoughts? Please let me know in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching. Mannix out.